Hey everybody, the last couple days I have had a lot of people send me this video trying to blame a lot of problems in America and a lot of the outrage of the looting and the protesting and the rioting and the burning of our cities around systemic racism. And this video has gone viral, millions and millions of views. And so I want to debunk it piece by piece. So the first part of the video talks about wealth inequality, not around necessarily racial inequality or anything around that. And then around the 48-second mark, something very clever happens. Take a look.
Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism.
You see how quickly he did that? All of a sudden we're talking about schools and systemic racism. And so this pivot to an untrained eye can all of a sudden make you seem as if like, gosh, maybe it's true. Maybe we need to blame everything that is wrong in the world on racism. Let me state very clearly, racism is evil. Any person who commits racism should have to atone for that. Racism is a sin, and I am a Christian. But also, I do not blame every single problem on the planet, especially around the inequality of certain individuals, solely and specifically around systemic racism. So around 1:30, the narrator says, well, because of this, Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home.
Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
I don't know what history of Black America he's looking at, but here's a fact for you. Verified by the federal government Census Bureau data, between the 1940s and the 1960s, Black Americans experienced the greatest period of prosperity of any group in American history. In fact, Black Americans were outpacing white Americans per individual wealth creation and community development. So despite the evil sin of redlining, what this narrator won't tell you is that Black Americans rose up against redlining and built beautiful, amazing, vibrant communities. But then something happened that this narrator dares not mention in the 1960s and 70s. The Great Society Act was passed by Democrat Lyndon Baines Johnson. So then the narrator says, well, as a result, the wealth held by white America, for every $100, Black Americans have $5. Watch the tape.
Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04.
And so as he says this, you almost think like, wow, racism must be to blame. What else could it possibly be? Because you see that pivot he did early in the video. He went from a problem with our public sector teacher unions and school funding and the lack of charter schools, lack of opportunity, and the war that is happening right now between good teachers and bad teachers, to all of a sudden blaming systemic racism. That quick pivot, you say, wow, that wealth inequality must be to blame. Racism must be to blame for that wealth inequality. No. In fact, if you factor in the fatherlessness rate, a Black person that is born with a mom and a dad and raised by a mom and dad is far more likely to succeed than a white person that is raised by a single mother. Now, I know there's a lot of single mothers out there that do an amazing job. These are just the statistics. I'm not trying to say that there's anything necessarily wrong by someone being raised by a single mother. But generally, a two-parent household is the guarantee of success. Not a 100% guarantee, but it's so predominantly and statistically overwhelming that you will stay out of poverty if you grow up in a two-parent home. But again, the narrator so slightly slips in this systemic racism argument. And so then he uses the Chicago example.
A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
What he fails to say is this is against the law. That anyone who is doing this, if anyone is ever discriminating based on race, this is against the 1960 Civil Rights Act, and they should go to jail. Never in this video does this narrator talk about how any of this sort of racist behavior in commerce is literally against law. We have a law on the books because of it. And then at 3:14, he says, well, the reason for all this, it hasn't stopped. What if Jamal breaks out of all this? He still has to go through implicit bias.
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have.
Implicit bias is garbage science. There is no data to back up the assertion that white people have some sort of implicit bias behind their decision making. So then he says this. He says, well, this is why the black unemployment rate is twice that of the white unemployment rate, without offering any sort of data to support that. This is the ultimate causation by correlation fallacy. Like, oh, well, because of it, then therefore, the only way we could possibly explain that twice as many black people are unemployed than white people is because of racism. Well, no, if you factor in education, upbringing, and a nuclear family, white unemployment and black unemployment basically even out. So if you factor in education, let's take an individual, a black person that might graduate from the University of Illinois and a white person that might graduate from the University of Illinois, the data shows over 10 years that they will be at the same level of earning. If not, the black person might benefit a little even more over time. So you just can't put this blanket blame of racism on everything. In fact, it is dangerous. It dilutes real racism in America. Real racists, people that are committed to turning people against each other based on their race, the identitarian movement. You know they're happy when everything gets blamed on racism because then it cheapens real racism.
You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve.
Wow, that is one of the most bold statements I've ever seen a person made in the video. That all the problems we have in America, incarceration rates, representation in Congress, education, and wealth are all because of this idea of systemic racism. Explain this to me. If racism is really in our DNA, as Barack Obama said it was, how was he elected president twice? Do you think that would have happened in the 1950s? Of course not. The failure to recognize any form of racial progress in America is wrong, and it is dangerous. We're actually a systemically unracist society. We are systemically accepting. We are systemically very racially tolerant. In fact, we are so systemically tolerant, we try to find issues where they do not exist. And so at 3:51, he then goes as far to say that we must recognize how slavery and Jim Crow has impacted what's happening today when it comes to wealth disparity and wealth inequality.
Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources.
Can anyone watching this video in the comments right now tell me what slavery had to do with black fatherlessness rates today? Black fathers are not in the home. 70% of black children, and might even be more than that in certain cities, are born without a father in the home. What does that have to do with slavery? I'll tell you what it has to do with Democrat exploitation. The same Democrat Party that voted unanimously against the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. The same Democrat Party that voted unequivocally against black civil rights in the 1960s. And no, the parties did not switch. The Democrats have always been about controlling black people in the 1860s, in the 1920s, in the 1960s, and today. Republicans were founded as an anti-slavery party. Republicans have always been about the liberation of the individual, the dignity of who you are as a person made in the image of God. And then finally comes full circle, all with the school argument. And here's the thing. I believe that being able to read is a civil rights issue. This is why I fight so hard against the Democrat-controlled public sector teacher unions. Good teachers should be paid more, and bad teachers should be fired. This narrator refuses to recognize or even talk about how in 5 schools in inner city Baltimore, they could not find a black kid that could read at grade level in math or English. And that's not because of school funding. Actually, these schools have more funding than ever before. The Department of Education is issuing tens of millions of dollars of grants. It's because the quality of the teacher has declined and there's no competition in our schools. And we've actually proven, because of charter schools and other school options, black kids can get a step up. It is lazy. It is dangerous to blame all the problems in America, as this video did, incarceration rates, representation, wealth, all because of a group of people that happened to be racist many decades ago. It fails to recognize public policy implications, choices, taking responsibility for your actions. It fails to recognize the fact that we subsidize fatherlessness in the community. It is so beyond dangerous, because then what it ends up happening is we can never actually have a conversation around how to fix these problems. And it was not just the black community that was hurt by this. Go to Appalachia. Go to predominantly white parts of America where fathers are no longer in the home. The Great Society was not colorblind. Yes, it impacted the black community more, but fatherlessness rate went up in every single community. And people say, well, Charlie, there's white privilege and we're systemically racist. If we are systemically racist as a country, why is it that Indian Americans, Asian Americans, and Taiwanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and Vietnamese Americans are the richest per groups, even more than Caucasian Americans? Average Caucasian American wealth per household or income per household is about $70,000 a year. Average Taiwanese American, about $114,000 a year. Indian American, $125,000 a year. How are we racist if anyone from around the world can succeed here? The answer is we're not. We're systemically unracist. This video is garbage. It is designed to turn us against each other, to blame all of our problems on a singular sin, and never admit that it's been the Democrats and leftist policies that are anti-empowerment, anti-human flourishing, and against what has made this country so beautiful and so great, to finally acknowledge how we can get back to a period of prosperity in our country. Don't just blame all of our problems on a singular sin. Look much more broadly. Act more maturely. Use a multivariate analysis. You actually might be a happier person. And we actually might be able to solve these problems once and for all. God bless.